Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Eliza Shah. I'm a program officer at the Terra Foundation, and I'm here at the Terra Paris Center together with my colleague Lucy Pike. And we're delighted that you are joining us today. And we're also delighted that our two speakers, Lari Pittman and Vija Getsy, have accepted the invitation to be in conversation with each other. I learned a few months ago that Lari would be in Paris to install an exhibition, and I thought it would be great if he could speak about his work. But with the ongoing difficult pandemic situation, Lari's trip from LA got postponed and in-person events were not yet on the horizon, but it still felt important to go ahead with the event in any case for various reasons that I just very briefly would like to mention. Lari has been engaging with marginalized forms and through that with marginalized identities throughout his career, and he's therefore a crucial figure in broadening what gets talked about in the history of American art. His work is iconic of identity politics of the 1990s, but it can also be traced back to the feminist program at Cal Arts of the 1970s, and it'll be really interesting to learn how these different moments compare with each other and also with the present, and especially as Lari can speak to this question, not only as an artist, but also as an educator. What's also fascinating about the beginnings of Lari's practice in the 1970s is that at the time, he chose painting at his medium in a period when painting was marginal, if one can say that. And I'm really looking forward to hearing Lari's exchange with David, whose current research addresses queer art and performance in the 1970s. Finally, Lari's work is deeply engaged with the US, not just the present and the recent past, but its violent colonial roots that we're reckoning with today, and this makes his work feel very timely. In fact, his most recent body of work addresses the related histories of the US and France, and if you are in Paris or planning to go before the end of July, if travel does in fact become easier, there's an opportunity to see his recent work at Levi-Gorby Gallery. Lari is Emeritus Distinguished Professor of Painting and Drawing at UCLA. He recently had a large retrospective titled Declaration of Independence at the Hammer Museum, which was organized by Connie Butler with Vanessa Arsmendi in 2019. And that exhibition also traveled to the Kistefos Museum in Norway. David is Galdabel McCom Finn Distinguished Professor of Art History at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and currently the Terra Visiting Professor at the JFK Institute of the Freie Universität in Berlin. He's the author of numerous books, so I'll only mention his newest one, which is titled Queer Behavior, Scott Burton and Performance Art, and that book is forthcoming from the University of Chicago Press in 2022. Lari and David will be in conversation with each other for about 40 minutes, after which we'll take your questions. And you can ask questions by raising your hand and we'll unmute you, but you can also, in the meantime, submit your questions to the Q&A box and we'll take them from there. And I should say that the event is being recorded and the recording will become available within 2 weeks of the event on the Terra Resources webpage. I'll leave the stage now to Lari and David, and I'll come back to take questions after their conversation. So handing over to you, David.
All right, thank you. And thank you, Eliza, thank you, Lucy, and the Terra Foundation for pairing up Lari and I for this conversation. Now, as Eliza said, one of the focal points of what we're going to talk about today is this kind of early moment in the 1970s. And the idea for pairing us up was in part because the book that I've just finished, that Eliza mentioned, is about an artist in New York who was a gay artist, Scott Burton, who was also influenced by feminism. And so that seemed to be a great way to think about that, the kind of connection to what's going on the West Coast. And so we're today, this is for the audience, Lari and I will talk about this moment of the late 70s into the works of the 80s, 90s, and today, but also really focus on the character of the Los Angeles scene at the time and be thinking about these overlapping histories of sexuality and gender and feminism and painting that Lari's practice does such a great job of providing an axial point to talk about. So Lari, let's just dive into the beginning. When you were an art student in the 1970s, you have stated on numerous occasions that the kind of intellectual and emotional home you found was with the feminist art program. Can you just talk a little bit about how you found the program and what your experience was with it and why it was so influential?
Well, first of all, it's such a pleasure to meet you again online, David, and to have this conversation. And I'm really honored to be asked by the Terra Foundation to have this conversation together. So, and also hello to everyone that's listening and watching today. I had gone, when I was 18 years old, I went to UCLA for 2.5 years. And I had always gone to private schools, so I had a hard adjustment attending such a large university. I was used to getting a tremendous amount of personal attention from my teachers and my professors, and all of a sudden I found myself in this enormous setting. So I was very, very unhappy, and I told my father that I wasn't happy at UCLA and that I had found this brand new school that was very experimental, which was CalArts at the time, California Institute of the Arts. And he said, Lari, I want you to be happy. And so let's see what we can find there. So I matriculated in 1973, 74. And during my interview, I met with Miriam Schapiro, who was one of the co-founders of the feminist art program, along with Judy Chicago. And she was very, very intrigued by my work and its insistence on the conceptualization of decoration, as she put it. And so I was actually the only male student that she took on as a private student at CalArts at the time, and the very first male student. The feminist art program, men were not allowed to be in the program officially, but I immediately found out that the queer population at CalArts orbited more around the feminist art program, the men did, and less around John Baldessari and Michael Asher at the time. So I was really welcomed, and I could see some sort of empathy and sympathy to what I was trying to attempt in my practice. So I was welcomed immediately into the orbit, peripherally though, not officially, into what we call first generation American feminism.
And what do you think the impact, or how did that change your work at the time? I mean, having these very heady conversations about the politics of decoration, and also being confronted with the need for a certain kind of separatism at the same time. What did that do to how you thought of yourself as an artist, at that early moment?
Well, I think when I was at that age, I was maybe 21. It was very, by nature, I'm ambitious and entrepreneurial as an artist. And I wanted to make something of myself in my practice. So it wasn't just about my interiority, but what I did want to see is my own reflection in some sort of lineage of art history. And up to then, I couldn't see my own reflection in the lineage of art history. And lo and behold, it was revealed through the art feminist program, was that if a queer person only at that time looked at the modernist timeline, you would never see your reflection. So under the guidance of the art historian Arlene Raven, we embarked really on what is now known as revisionist art history. And it's not that we were anxious necessarily. I wasn't anxious about the chronicled modernist timeline, but I was anxious because I couldn't see myself. So and for me, it wasn't about disassembling the modernist timeline, but to somehow look at take a deeper dive into our history, which would have to include the decorative arts, the applied arts, dealing with female artists, queer artists. So that was really kind of an incredible opening for me to be able to see myself in a new history, but also project into the future the possibilities for my own practice as well.
It's really interesting. One of the sort of misconceptions about the 70s is that after all of the upheaval that sort of crystallized with the Stonewall Rebellion, that there was suddenly this kind of like explosion of availability for in the art world for queer artists. And actually throughout the 70s, it's still a very, very difficult path. And especially because there's also these kind of divergent paths that happen around lesbian feminism and many gay male artists who are working in very different communities and sometimes antagonistic to those to other positions. And so that's why I think it's so interesting to find these moments of solidarity and coalition that are happening, because they're few, and also because there are the path towards being an out gay artist in the 70s was still a very rough one. I mean, there was plenty of gay and lesbian artists in the 1970s, but there were not any who were foregrounding that in their work and able to exhibit it. And so to be thinking of that, that's that uphill battle. And so in Los Angeles at the time, you'd already alluded to this, that many of the gay male artists found the feminist art program to be more, a bit of a safer space. But what was the general attitude in LA in the second half of the 70s about being overt in one's work, or even in just one's identity as a gay or lesbian artist at the time? What kind of possibilities or obstacles were there in the late 70s?
Well, I think there were both opportunities and obstacles, but generally I'm a very optimistic person. And I think that, from very, very early on, I always understood my privilege as an artist and as a citizen, but I was also living in Los Angeles, which has always been Los Angeles in Southern California, which has historically been a very, very progressive part of America. So when I was very young, and also at CalArts, I met my life partner, my husband, Roy Dowell, who's also an artist. And we've been together now for 48 years. And I think what we did is we decided as individual artists and as a couple that our mantra was to integrate, but not assimilate. So a certain amount of separatism was really something that we weren't socially interested in at all, that we wanted to integrate ourselves into a larger society, but not assimilate. So it was really always on our terms. Also, I think what was a bit difficult is that there was more room for outlaw artists, surprisingly. And we were what was known there, we were good boys. In other words, we were, kind of traditional, well-behaved bourgeois boys in our early 20s. So I think that actually ended up being a much more disruptive force in many ways in so-called polite society than, let's say, the artist who adopted a more outlaw position, because that way the outlaw position could be safely othered and compartmentalized. Whereas I think that I posed more of a threat because I was one of them to a certain degree, the La Borgesia de Los Angeles, you know, that type of thing. So I think what it was is that like I said, I'm a very determined person. I'm polite, but I'm insistent. And I made my way into the art world. I wanted to show. I could smell, and to this day still smell, the scent of homophobia. So I either tell it to back off or I don't get near it. And so the modus operandi is really quite the same when I was 20. So in the world that I lived in when I was 20 and completely out of the closet, I found that there were, maybe to an audience who's European, I have to make this very sad distinction. But I lived in an educated America, a very privileged, educated America that didn't have, the people that I dealt with professionally didn't have those biases. So my trajectory within the bubble that I lived in was frustrating, but at the same time, opportunities presented itself. It was actually more daily life that proposed most of the challenges,
Yeah, there's 2 points I want to draw out of what you just said. First is this idea of the politeness and the infiltrating that you were doing, and I love this concept. And I think when we start talking about your paintings later, I think this same attitude is there, where we have these subversive or orgiastic images that are not at first blush they don't appear there, and they kind of creep up on you as they're the longer you spend with them. So we will, when I show some images, we'll be able to kind of dive into that. But I do want to maybe put a little more pressure on this the scene of the late 70s, because I understand that the sort of privileged realm of the art school was already somewhat insular and allowed for certain forms of protection and a different level of respect than what one might encounter on the street. But at the same time, there was also, especially in Los Angeles in the 70s, a kind of clubbiness around art schools and the training. And you already mentioned the kind of circle around Baldessari, and there's a kind of there is a kind of art world version of macho that gets worked out there. And so I wonder if you could just talk about the kind of camps that were there within Cal Arts, but also more broadly, because that's one of the ways in which the kind of history of Los Angeles art is known, is through the importance of the art schools and then the traditions that they make. But within them, there's also these kind of divisions. So maybe if you could just talk a little bit more about that choice between the Feminist Art Program and the Baldessari Circle.
First of all, to clarify, Baldessari was one of my very strongest supporters during my time at Cal Arts and all through the beginning of my professional life. And he was actually on my graduation committee, my thesis committee. So I just wanted to make that clear. I think the problem occurred more in the student body. I think there were two groups. There was the orbit around Michael Asher, John Baldessari, and post-studio art, which was the kind of foundation for the emergence of the pictures generation in the United States. And then around the feminist program, which was Vija Celmins, Elizabeth Murray, Judy Pfaff, Miriam Schapiro, Judy Chicago. There was, so there were these two camps where, and I would say, I've said this recently, that for me, the pictures generation is fundamentally quite heterosexually normative in that sense, and homophobic. And I know nobody wants to hear that because that's the most lauded history of CalArts. So it wasn't necessarily in the professorship, that kind of division. It was really more in the student body and self-electing the kind of gang and territory that you wanted to belong to. So I think that there was a tremendous amount of intellectual shade and attitude from the post-studio work to people who had elected to make paintings in this very kind of reductive, and deeply uninformed attitude of that painting was not a conceptual activity. So my answer to that is a very haughty queer boy, as I would just say, talk to the hand, or get out of my face. So, so there was always this intellectual tension between the two camps, the kind of feminist camp and the post-studio, to be known as the pictures generation camp. But so that's actually also how I realized that I never knew how to physically fight. I wish I could learn how to physically fight now, like to throw a good punch. But I did learn to develop a very sharp tongue. And it was because of those two camps that I think I developed my intellectual prowess. But I pride myself on my prowess as being informed by the centrality of being queer, whereas the intellectual prowess of the pictures generation was informed by the centrality of them being heteronormative, So I was able to almost participate in a very, very strong exchange, and rarely was I defeated.
I can believe that just from talking to you a little. So you mentioned this kind of, this criticism of painting that is characteristic of that early moment of what is sometimes thought of as postmodernism, sometimes called postmodernism, but which is, and I'll show some of your paintings in just a sec, but the painting, and especially your painting, is also involved in a critique of representation and an analysis of the sign and all of these things that we associate with those people who hated painting. But I just wonder if you could tell us what it was like being a painter at that moment in the 70s, before there was the so-called return of painting in the 1980s. But in these earlier years, what were some of the difficulties, but also the pleasures of being a painter in that scene?
Well, first of all, the idea that painting was dead is a concoction and a myth that was in propaganda from the class of 1968. So painting has always been a part of US culture. It's just that maybe it didn't occupy the outlets, the critical outlets as much, certainly that was not, it wasn't talked about as much. I think one of the things as a young artist, I elected to paint for two reasons. Number one, I was excited that it was precisely at its low point of critical discussion. I thought, again, when I said I was entrepreneurial by nature, I don't mean in a capitalistic way, in a as a financial armature or anything, but really entrepreneurial in the sense that I saw painting as this kind of devastated landscape, and it was a complete fixer-upper, you know, in that sense. You know, it was something that it had been abandoned to a certain degree. And that abandonment of that investigation by so many artists in the 70s, I don't know, maybe I have a poetic nature in me. I loved its abandonment and its new possibilities. I think that it just fit my emotional registers as well, as a person, as a human being. And I was excited that it was at its low point critically and that it had been abandoned as something of interest. I think though that fits in very strongly to queerness, you know, and to the capacity to survive and to look at cracks and openings within culture that one can resuscitate or give CPR to or re-represent anew under new authorship. So that was, I guess, it was an exciting moment for me. And so that's kind of how it started. But then again, there were people painting in school, and we were given tremendous attention nevertheless, you know, or because we were painters as well in the minority. Like, who were these strange creatures who were electing to make these objects called paintings? Mm-hmm. So we were also a wonderful curiosity, and because of that, we received a lot of attention as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love this idea of the abandonment of painting by many, and then you kind of care for it and adopt it again, because it's a very queer practice, right? And it's very characteristic of many queer practices to revalue those things that are devalued by mainstream culture, because that's the structure of the term queer and its reappropriation are all about that, about the finding ways to devalue things or people, and then the need to take that that designation and turn it around. So I think what you say about that connection is very strong, and we could think about it in a lot of different artist practice as well. But also, just the idea of making a painting, especially there in relationship to the kind of critique of painting as just being about precious objects and things like that. To make a painting is to produce an image from material, from nothing. And that's also a kind of world making right there. And and I'm thinking about other painters who emerged in the 1970s working from queer perspective, someone like Amy Silman, who's also talked about that, that the act of painting as a kind of queer action of making something from nothing, but also using these things that we were told are hegemonic, but using them against themselves. So there's some definite connections there with some other artists. But I want to, at this point, take a moment to share my screen so that we can see some of your paintings. And just for the audience, I just did a little selection that kind of represents a range from some early work in the 1980s onwards to some of the works that are on view in Paris today. Larry, if you want to say anything as I'm going through, just please feel free, but we don't have to. It's more just I wanted to kind of load some images into everyone's image buffer.
That sounds great.
So let me do this. Okay. And I'm not going to narrate them too much either, but just I wanted to show some of the range, and also the range of materials here in this early painting from 1983. There's gold leaf and paint, but also we move into lots of different supports for painting. So these paintings on gourds, which have this which both have this kind of like delicate painting on them, but also take on these organic, the organic material suggests other organic forms and other organs. And this changes depending on the gourd that's chosen. So there's a whole range of different possible bodily metaphors that can emerge from these shapes and sizes. Just to show a few other works that kind of move us into the late 80s, and especially works that around in the late 80s start to register and talk about politics in a different way, and specifically register the AIDS crisis, among other things, not just that, but thinking about the ways in which visual imagery can register questions of desire, as well as the different ways in which bodies and sexualities can be visualized or seen. So we'll come back to this pairing a little bit later. I just want to show a couple of details, and we'll talk about these two in more detail in a little bit. But just to show a few other works that, again, increasingly engage with these questions of how bodies are rendered and how they can be multiplied and combined as new possibilities. And then as well, I remember right around the time of these paintings, I was actually interning at a gallery in New York, at Jay Gorney Gallery. And I remember Jay talking about how incredibly subversive it was to include images of credit cards in paintings at the time. And he was talking about your work because, at the time. And it's like, so I think we have to just acknowledge that from the present moment, some of these works may not, we need to remember how rare it is to actually address things like commerce directly in these works. So I don't have much more to say about that, but I just wanted to tell that little anecdote. Just to show a few more to get us closer to the present. These are more recent works. And again, the engagement with histories of design, textiles, decoration, the history of art are all central to the practice. And then these are a couple of the newest works that we'll also be able to talk about at the end. Okay, so that was a kind of quick overview for everyone, just so you could kind of see it. But I was wondering, Larry, can we talk about a couple of the paintings now? Would you,
Yes,
is that
absolutely.
okay? So why don't I put on, let's see, this comparison for us, because these works are 6 years apart, and they seem very, very different in some ways, but there's kind of a lot of similarities, I think, in terms of the attitude and the of them. And in particular, there's a lot of, you employ in your paintings a lot of humor and double entendre and visual puns and many different forms of double reading. And can you talk to us a little bit about like the role of humor and punning in your work?
Well, I guess maybe it is something of I think very early on, I identified some sort of maneuver conceptual device by which I wanted my work to function within a big registry of the population. In other words, I wanted to capture both the highly educated American population, but I also wanted to capture the daily audience as well. And then I think what I did, I think the humor or the punning or the almost retail lightness of the work, that idea that the work almost seems almost vacuous in a way, or it seems to flirt with a type of, you know, almost cliche, you know, cultural cliche to a certain degree, was a type of conceptual smokescreen that I love, and to this day still love setting up in the work, to weed out people who are mean and actually don't have the guts to actually delve into the complexity and nuance of a type of simultaneity of meaning and of emotional and psychological registers. I think that comes from the fact that my first language is Spanish. My mother was Colombian, my father American. So I think there's something very strong about language and its relationship to cultural development. So the idea of simultaneity of contrasting events, i.e., as you say, humor and double entendre, and perhaps even insinuations of philosophical depth, were not strange bedfellows or contradictory even. Maybe the word that comes to mind is that there is, and I use two words in French simply because there's really not quite the same translation in English. There are some in Spanish, but the ones that I think of that I've always informed the work is jouissance and tristesse. And I think that that is kind of the registers that are in the painting. So the jouissance is the humor, the playfulness of the work, the exteriority, the shout out, you know, that the works do shout outs, and they reach out to the audience. They're not withholding, they're gregarious. The works are highly socialized, and that's the first screen. And then if the viewer gives it time, then they will see that first screen actually exacerbates in a positive way the darker or more existential or more pathological even reads of the painting.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier with your attitude about what I called infiltration for you, but that kind of,
thank you.
And we might think of as a kind of, it's approachability as a kind of lure, which is how the painting seemed to operate by giving us some immediately recognizable images and also forms of doubling that are happening there. But then the longer one spends with the paintings, the more, again, the layers of emotion and complexity seem to come out. But by that point, we're already trapped in the painting.
I mean, maybe a clarification also that is very important to me politically is that I've never been interested in kitsch. So I just want to put that out, that I feel that kitsch by nature is socially mean-spirited. And that's something as a queer person, I was not interested in participating in that kind of mean-spiritedness that is called upon to both enliven and to activate ideas of kitsch.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think it's the opposite of kitsch. It's trying to find a set of visual languages that are open to complexity, but not alienating to many different kinds of audiences. And so for me, the way I would say it is like the graphic simplicity and clarity that you strive for in the painting style is one of the things that makes it open to multiple kinds of audiences, including those who may not know or care about the history of painting. And that's not something that we can say about some other painting styles, right? And I think that play of the recognizable and also of the recognizable joke as the lure is part of the joy of decoding these paintings. Let me just, for the audience, I'm gonna just pursue one thing. The 69 that you use a lot in this is this beautiful example of this, because it's a, it's kind of one of the, it's one of those numbers that has a lot of metaphor and bodily attention attached to, and it can seem like a crass joke at first, right? And like a schoolboy joke. But one of the things that your repetition of 69, both in this painting and in other paintings, starts to do, for me again, is that you see that the 6 and the 9 are the same form, doubled and moved around. And it's a way of evoking a whole complexity of relationships and kinds of bodies and all of that with a figure that is fundamentally the same but different from the figure it's coupled with. And I think that's that's like something that, again, seems at first like a kind of like the easy joke when one encounters it, but then the more you look at it, and in this painting, Visceral and Needy, right? There's the 6s and the 9s echo the shape of the ears that are there. And so there's all of these kind of visual puns and doubleness that's happening with it. So that's what I always enjoy looking at your paintings, is because they're immediately available to me, like when I look at them and I can see and recognize all of these things. And then after about 5 minutes, nothing looked like it did when I started. So, and I think that's, that's interesting to think about under the structure of something like the pun or the double entendre or humor, which again, seems easy at first, but then it makes you think in a deeper way. Let me go to another comparison so we can talk a little bit differently about it. And so here I'm just showing 2 paintings from the late 80s. And just want to say that, like that use of humor and that kind of conceptual complexity is also tied into other deeper themes like love and death. I mean, you use the word insinuations of philosophical depth earlier, which is a nice self-deprecating way of doing it. But these are not just insinuations. These are actually, many of your paintings meditate on the grand themes. So I was just wondering if you could, sort of talk about that, the seriousness that, and those of those big themes that's also part of the work.
Well, I mean, and I think these take place during a very tumultuous social period as we find ourselves once again globally, and then of course within the United States and in Europe as well. This was the kind of first pandemic really in our modern life, which was the AIDS crisis. And so how do, I'm not, how do I answer that? How do I answer that panic, that that social and personal destabilization, the internalization of ideas of the contaminated body, the pathologized body, the sick body. And it was a moment, I think, I guess I will use an older style word for anyone who was gay, as opposed, I'll use that word, and gay male especially. It was a tremendous period of deeply internalized registers of anxiety. And that's really what I wanted to respond to. So as a way of answering or dealing with both social narrative and autobiographical narrative, I decided that I wanted to devise a whole level of insistence of, in a way, a type of both renunciation, emotional renunciation to the realities of the moment, but also insistence of a type of wellness and hopefulness, and also of goodness, you know, that somehow, because the ongoing conversation was the pathologized body, and we knew that. I wanted to, so the one that's this wholesomeness, beloved and despised, continues regardless. It's interesting because David, when early in your introduction, you used the word marginalized, I guess maybe it's because I'm so stubborn a person. And so I always only spoke about my centrality in a way. I never, I knew that blunt reality of marginalization, but I could not really live my daily life under that rubric. I think that was not just boring, it was joyless. So I think that these paintings are, they are not political paintings, but they work politically, which is different. And it proposes that next to the dualities of these narratives being beloved and despised, they continue regardless. And in the regardless in this case is with a great amount of hope and wholesomeness at the same time. So the large one, the large vertical one, is really a story of two gentlemen meeting, being attracted to each other on the bottom. One obviously has an erection, and the ejaculate of the erection is actually constructing this fence, this bridge that somehow attaches itself to the other male who does not have an erection. So obviously there's someone who's a bit bolder and making a communication to another person. And then they've obviously bonded. There's a toast on a table. And then later on in the evening, so the bottom is daytime, and then the top of the painting is evening, and they're on the riverbank making out. And now the bridge that they constructed through their act of mutual desire is just now being used by the quotidian world and by society at large. I think in this case, I really loved, was looking at Giotto's paintings and the idea of continuous narrative where Christ would appear in several different moments within the pictorial plane. So that's kind of the structuring of the event. And I felt that the idea of continuous narrative was also political in the sense is that it proposed that the protagonists were once there, they're there now, and they will continue being there in the future.
Well, and also just that desire is productive. It builds things.
Hello?
and
Yes.
and it, like that's part, that is part of it. I see we're running a little bit low on time, so I just want to make sure we can talk about some of the newest work. So let me just frame this by, with a kind of two-part question. One is that many of these, the style that you've been working in from the 1980s onward seems very current right now. It seems like everyone's caught up to you in terms of the ways in which images and paintings are being conceived of. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, but also talk about the ways in which your own style changes, because I know that at another point you've said that whenever you embark on a new series of paintings, you make a rule for yourself about not doing something that you've done before, so to try and shake it up a little bit. So what's, again, maybe start by telling us about the newest work, and we'll expand out to my other question in a second.
Well, the title of the exhibition at Levy Gorvy right now in the Marais district is titled Diorama. And I'm interested in the diorama as a museological conceit that ultimately is about the falsity or fictive nature of history as it's recorded. And I think one of the things that paintings do so beautifully is their capacity to be fictive and to lie as well. I hate the over-essentialization that happens in the culture world or in the popular world as well, that paintings or art even has to always tell the truth, or that it intrinsically tells the truth. And I found that problematic. So I love the agency of the fictive as a vehicle by which one might ruminate on the truth. So the diorama is a fictive museological concoction that of presentation of historical events, and that's kind of what I tried to do in these paintings. Going back to your idea, I'm not really a traditional, how would you say it? I think that comes out of my education at Cal Arts. I'm really a project-based painter. It's not necessarily a continuum practice. It's actually with stops and starts and stylistic shifts and twitches, visual twitches. So that part of it is that, I have an anxiety, as all artists should have, about becoming redundant. And the very positive anxiety, regardless of one's age, I'm almost 70, about issues of remaining contemporary, or that regardless of age, contemporaneity is still within one's reach. So I don't know if that's really answering your question, David, but I think the changing of styles and working around it's a project-based practice. The restlessness of the practice comes out of hard-earned insecurities that I have as an artist, hard-earned insecurities. And I'm happy that they're there. So I think that that's kept the practice moving. I'm also very self-critical. And I think that that's the catalyst for the work changing from body of work to body of work. And a certain restlessness that I think if one looked at the retrospective, one could detect that restlessness. And it's restlessness and not dilettantism.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, even though there's a lot of change, if to look at your retrospective catalog, for instance, there's a lot of change that happens, but there's also a strong, consistent sensibility that runs through the work. And I think that's one of the things that's so interesting. For instance, this newest work.
I love hearing the word sensibility. It's hardly uttered anymore. But I'm wondering, maybe that's something, it's something that I hear historically women use more, certainly in 19th century literature, the idea of sense and sensibility. that maybe sensibility, if there's something, as you say, that goes through the work, some sort of lifeline or whatever, is that sensibility is there consistently, and that sensibility of simultaneity of opposite events,
Mm-hmm.
that can somehow produce a rethinking of things as well, that it's that simultaneity of opposite and unrelated events that can incise some sort of seismic shift of thinking, or microseismic thinking.
Yeah, and that's those opposite things that come together is also manifested in these strategies of doubleness and translation and all of these other ways of seeing the same thing from multiple perspectives. And maybe that's one of the kind of run the lines through many of the different styles and kinds of works. But I think that's lovely. And maybe I've just been teaching the 70s too much, and that's why I'm talking about sensibility. Since it's right in the forefront of my head right now. But it does seem to be, in some ways, a useful way of talking. It gets a bad reputation as a word when it's talked about as something characteristic of a group of people, like a category. But with an individual, it definitely is, I think, more appropriate to think about the approach to the world as another way of thinking about what a sensibility would be. And I think, especially in the comments that you've just made, you just captured that approach very beautifully about this idea of the meeting and the doubleness in the translation. So I want to thank you for all of the your candidness and all of the answers and what we've talked about. It's been great, yeah. But I also want to give the opportunity for some questions, because we've been going for a little while.
Okay.
So Eliza's going to pitch us the questions. They will probably mostly be for you, and that's good, because I've talked enough, but I'm happy to chime in whenever I need to.
First of all, thank you both so much. This has been really, really great. I want to sneak in one question of my own, and then I see we have audience questions already. I wanted to just briefly come back to history as a subject matter in your work, Lari. And when I say that, I'm thinking about the images that we saw, the examples of your recent work with the jewelry, but also the earlier works that David showed from the Beloved and Despised series. And if I look at these images, I see these kind of references to the colonial era, and I'm interested in how images of queerness and the colonial past and issues of, I suppose, patriarchy hang together in your work.
Wow, that's a big question, Eliza. I think one of the things that that if let's say, especially in the mid-70s when I came out, I know it's such a weird thing to say, because I don't know if I love young kids don't even think about it anymore in quite the same way. But when I did, I realized instantly that a lot of the social promises or dictums that have always been part of American education were fundamentally false. But that's also the reason why at age 13, I was 12 or 13 years old, I decided that I was an atheist as well. And I think it was just, I don't know, again, I think my atheism at age 12 and 13 already set the groundwork for a type of, not cynicism, but skepticism that is always promoted by nation states, number one, and certainly an expert at that is the United States at that type of propaganda. So I think being already, actually, I became an atheist before I became gay, or acknowledged my centrality, my true identity. I think that that's always been a foundation, you know, the kind of precariousness of individual citizenship that is true for everybody in cities, in nation states. It's so precarious and in many cases fictive. The guarantees are the guarantees that are promoted are always bloated and exaggerated. And so I think just how I developed as a person, the development of, you know, acknowledging my queerness really immediately just put a light on all of the social propaganda that nation states really are experts at. And so that's why I wanted to, I've always wanted to contemplate the present moment by revisiting the past. So that's kind of what those paintings are. And in a way, what the paintings that are in Paris now make in this case, use jewelry as a conduit to think about identity and social politics as well.
Thanks so much, Larry, for taking on this question. We have one raised hand in the audience from Justin Polera, so I'm going to unmute you now. And
hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I just wanted to ask about the relationship maybe to theatricality. I know there's a very loaded word in terms of painting and maybe even other mediums, but I thought of like the movement of P&D in general, this return to pattern and the ideas of pattern, and this 69 seems very theatrical. I could imagine myself in this action. And also David had mentioned getting kind of trapped in the painting and then starting to decode because it's so beautiful and seductive. And I think you told this whole story, which I thought was lovely, about like there's kind of a bridge being built with the desire at the bottom in the daytime of the wholesomest beloved despised continues, and then a dancing on the bridge above. So anything about a theatricality in your work. And thank you for this incredible conversation.
Thank you, Justin. I think theatricality is both a seduction and a pushback. You know, there's something, again, like for example, one of my favorite lines is Cho-Cho-san says in the opera, sola, perduta e abbandonata e felice. You know, I'm alone, I'm lost, I'm abandoned, but I'm happy. And I think opera does that all the time. You know, I think that maybe a word, a Sontagian word that is still useful is camp. You know, that the theatricalization of the event, of the painting, and what's called upon to you as a viewer to interact with that theatricality, maybe induces a type of polymorphousness of the event that usually historically the language of camp or the performance of camp has periodically done in history.
First of all, thank you, Justin, for your question. I want to take one question from the Q&A box. Jenny Sorkin, Larry, is asking you, And I'm reading the question: has your teaching been influenced by the feminist art program, and Schapiro in particular, on your development as a pedagogue?
No. My pedagogical practice has been completely informed by my students and their work. My job is to respond to their reality, they have no responsibility to respond to my reality. So I always approached the formation of my pedagogical practice to their needs and trying to understand what they wanted to do in their work, what they needed to see in their work. So no, my pedagogical practice has evolved and it's completely informed by my students.
Though, Larry, I would just say that what you just articulated is actually pretty consistent with some versions of feminist pedagogy. So
Okay.
maybe there's some, after effects that are there.
Yeah, but not Miriam Schapiro. That was different. Yeah.
Thanks, Jenny, for your question. Jonathan Katz, I see you've raised your hand, and I'm unmuting you now. And hi.
Hello.
Jonathan, it's been a long time.
It's been a long time, Larry. Hi, David. So just a real quick question. I wonder to what extent the semiotic play in your work is a deliberate citation of the kind of decoding games that a generation of artists before you, the 50s artists of Johns, Rauschenberg et al., engaged, and do you see yourself in any way in line with that?
I think those are my grandparents, but I also see the continuation of code in art by queer artists. So I think that, like, for example, there is a resurgence of queer abstraction. I think that is still advancing ideas of code. I think an artist like Math Bass, who is a trans painter, is advancing, they are advancing ideas of code in the work, which seem very queer. So I think in many ways, code is alive and well. It's just that it's mutated in the way it's being performed.
And if I could just follow up then, to what extent do the different social conditions that obtain now, when we no longer need to code, why, in short, is code still such a vital aspect of queer art making?
Don't straight people talk in code all the time? I mean, my point of view, yes. So I think it's as natural for me to speak in code. It's not the lost language of cranes, it's actually a contemporary English, through visual means. Okay,
thank you.
And if I could jump in, I would also say contemporary uses of code by queer artists it's also about a certain resistance to scrutiny, resistance to surveillance, the ability to code switch and in-talk as means of survival and flourishing. So there's ways in which, as Larry was saying, that practice of coding is a ongoing and vibrant way of in-speaking. So as a footnote to that.
Thank you, David.
Jordan Treller, you're being unmuted.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, okay.
Hi, Jordan.
Thanks for taking the question. You mentioned your connection to Spanish-speaking cultures and your Colombian background. And this might be sort of a question out of left field, but in the 70s, to what degree was the sort of circles running around Chicano art in the LA context and Cal arts intersecting? My impression is that they were pretty separate, but yeah, from your perspective, I'd be really interested to hear to what degree was that sort of on your radar, people like Judy Baca or Asco. Yeah, that would be great.
I was certainly aware of Judy Baca and Asco, although on, you know, maybe, you know, and the art world has all sorts of social circles. I really didn't, you know, have much dealings with those groups. I think that, you know, I think one of the grand misconceptions, both in current academia and also in broad American culture, is that Latinx culture is in no way monolithic. It's huge, it's broad. Latino culture is not a racial identity. It's so huge. It's as unmanageable as anything else. So but I think that within CalArts, I think there was still a Eurocentricity even within feminism, feminist discourse. So, you know, I was very, very much aware of let's say, Remedios Varo, Frida Kahlo, Leonor Fini, you know, the modernist Brazilian artists, Ligia Pape, Ligia Clark, Elio Itisita, you know, but they, you know, that the idea of Latino was a much more Eurocentric idea still, which is a big part of Latino identity as well. So I would say that the Chicano community was not really discussed as much within the program at CalArts, although it was alive and well and participated actively within the social fabric of the city, and in many cases at Woman House, the early kind of exposition center in Los Angeles, and in various other locations.
If I could just jump in here and just say that, you know, in the 70s, many of the Chicanx artists who are working with queer themes, people like Mundo Meza, Joey Terrell, Teddy Sandoval, operating in East LA, and actually in opposition to many of the kind of formalized structures of the art world, like galleries and art schools. And so again, I think especially we have to remember the Los Angeles, the geography is quite spread out, and that there is, you know, there's lots of overlapping things that don't always meet as much as they might in a different kind of city. But there are some really remarkable queer practices that are also being done in that oppositional space. And I'm saying this in part just to kind of give a shameless plug for the next Terra event, which that I'm organizing, which is here at the John F. Kennedy Institute for North American Studies. On June 3rd, there will be a symposium on American art that's called Lives, Biography and Autobiography in New Writing on American Art. And one of the papers will be on Teddy Sandoval by Andine Chavoya from Williams College. So sorry to hijack the end of the Q&A, but this is the next Terra event that's happening on June 3rd, and it'll also be on the Terra website. So, but with that, we are out of time. So I want to, again, thank you so much, Larry, for everything. This was great. And
thank you, David.
And thank you, Eliza, as well. I'll let you take the last word.
Thank you both so much. Many thanks to our audience. I realize there are numerous questions which we didn't get to in the Q&A box. And among those of you who raised your hands, you can find my email address on the Terra website. If you want me to forward any of your questions to the speakers, I will try to get you more answers. And apart from that, thank you all so much for joining. Take care, and we hope to see you again soon.